In December of 1944, just 12 weeks after he won one of the most lopsided armored victories of the Second World War, the United States Army quietly sent Major General John Shirley Wood home. He was never given another combat command. He died 20 years later in Reno, Nevada, and most Americans today have never heard his name. This is the story of why Lorraine, northeastern France, September 19, 1944, just before dawn, the fog rolls in from the Saale River like a slow gray tide. It swallows the wheat fields. It swallows the stone barns. It swallows the country roads where French peasants once walked their cattle to market on cold autumn mornings. Visibility drops to 40 meters, then 30. The sun has not yet broken the horizon, and the morning is the color of cold steel. In the trees east of a village called Bézange-la-Petite, 80,000 horsepower waits in silence. 45 tons of hardened German armor, sloped like the edge of a knife, mounting a high-velocity 75mm cannon, long enough to skewer 2 American tanks in a single shot. The Panzerkampfwagen 5 Panther, Ausführung G, was the most advanced medium tank in the world, fresh off the assembly lines of Bavaria and Saxony, crewed by men who had survived the Eastern Front, and there were dozens of them, in 2 full brigades, with orders signed by Adolf Hitler himself. Their target was a single American armored division, isolated, exposed, nearly 80 kilometers ahead of its own infantry support, dangling at the end of a supply line so long it stretched all the way back to the beaches of Normandy. It looked like the most catastrophic mistake of George S. Patton's career. Berlin certainly thought so. But somewhere in a farmhouse command post on the western side of that fog bank, a 56-year-old American major general with thinning hair and tired eyes was waiting. He was not panicked. He was not surprised. He had drawn this map with his own hand. He had positioned every tank, every artillery battery, every forward observer. He had chosen this ground because he wanted the Germans to attack here. He had baited them, and in the next 11 days, the most powerful armored counter-offensive Germany would launch in the west before the Battle of the Bulge was going to march with full confidence and full momentum directly into the killing zone of a man whose own army would relieve him from command less than 3 months later. This is the story of how the Germans believed Patton had made a fatal mistake, and the story of how they were wrong about the wrong general. To understand what happens in that fog, you have to go back. Not far, just 2 months. July 25th, 1944. Operation Cobra. The American First Army under General Omar Bradley blasts a hole through the German defensive line west of Saint-Lô in Normandy. For 6 brutal weeks, the Allies had bled inch by inch through the hedgerow country, ancient earthen walls thick with centuries of vegetation, every field a fortress, every lane a graveyard. Then Cobra broke the dam. On August 1st, 6 days after Cobra, the United States Third Army was officially activated. Its commander was Lieutenant General George Smith Patton, Jr. The Third Army poured through the gap Bradley had made, and what followed was, in the literal sense, a campaign without precedent. In 4 weeks, Patton's columns covered more ground than the German army had seized in nearly a year during the 1940 invasion of France. They drove off the edges of their own operational maps. They captured supply depots intact because the German engineers could not burn them fast enough. They seized bridges before the demolition charges could be set. Entire divisions of the Wehrmacht surrendered without firing a shot. By the second week of September, Patton's tanks had crossed the Meuse, then the Moselle. They were less than 100 kilometers from the German border. They were moving faster than anyone on either side had imagined an army could move, and they were running out of gas. Every gallon of fuel had to be trucked 400 kilometers from the Normandy beaches. The Red Ball Express, a convoy system, manned largely by African-American quartermaster soldiers who would never receive the recognition they deserved, ran 24 hours a day. They burned out their own engines. They drove until they fell asleep at the wheel, and they could not keep up. Tank platoons halted mid-advance because their fuel tanks ran dry. Artillery batteries rationed shells. The entire Western offensive began to choke on its own success. And at the very tip of the spear, far ahead of everyone else, sat the 4th Armored Division, George S. Patton was 58 years old. He was a Virginia aristocrat, a horseman, a cavalry officer in the old sense who had ridden into Mexico chasing Pancho Villa in 1916 and had spent the years between the wars studying ancient battles in his private library. He believed in personal destiny. He believed with a fervor that disturbed some of his superiors that he had been a soldier in every great army of history. He was also, in September 1944, just 1 year past the worst scandal of his career. In August 1943, in 2 separate field hospitals on the island of Sicily, Patton had walked into wards full of wounded men and slapped 2 American soldiers who were suffering from combat exhaustion. He called them cowards. He screamed at them in front of nurses and doctors and other patients. When the story broke in the American press 3 months later, the public reaction nearly ended his command. General Dwight D. Eisenhower forced him to apologize, in person, to thousands of his own men. He was kept on the sidelines through the entire Normandy invasion. The Third Army was, in some real sense, his second chance. He had been moving fast across France, in part because he believed, correctly, that if he stopped, someone would take it away from him. But there was something else about Patton that the Germans, studying his movements from across the Moselle, fundamentally misread. They saw an aggressive, vain, reckless cavalryman who had been promoted beyond his competence. They saw the slapping general, the strutting general. The general who carried ivory, handled pistols, and wore polished cavalry boots in the field. They did not see that he had spent 20 years thinking about exactly the kind of war he was now fighting. They did not see that beneath the theater of his public persona was a careful student of armored doctrine, a reader of Heinz Guderian's pre-war writings, a commander who understood, perhaps better than any German general except Erwin Rommel, what tanks could do when they were truly unleashed. And they did not see that he had something the Germans did not have. He had a subordinate who was, in many ways, even more dangerous than he was. Major General John Shirley Wood was 56 years old. He stood 6 feet tall, broad in the shoulders, with a square jaw and the kind of plain, weathered face that belonged on a Midwestern farm. He had grown up in Arkansas. He had graduated from the University of Arkansas before going to West Point, where he had tutored other cadets in mathematics and earned the nickname that would stick to him for the rest of his life, P. Wood. The P stood for professor. He spoke fluent French. He had spent years in Europe between the wars, studying foreign armored doctrine, watching the French build their tank divisions and the Germans build theirs. He had been a cavalry officer when the cavalry still meant horses, and he had been one of the first American officers to understand, instinctively and completely, that the age of horses was over and the age of tanks had begun. His men in the 4th Armored Division did not call him P. Wood. They called him Tiger Jack. He commanded from the front. He rode with the leading combat command, sometimes in a tank, sometimes in a jeep, and he did not wait for permission. He had been formally reprimanded more than once for ignoring orders he considered foolish. He had personality conflicts with nearly every superior officer he had ever served under. He argued, he pushed, he shouted, and he was, by the unanimous quiet agreement of the men who fought beside him, one of the finest armored division commanders the United States produced in the entire war. His doctrine was simple. Tanks should not fight as siege weapons. They should not crawl up to enemy positions and trade shots like ironclad battleships. They should move. They should bypass. They should strike where the enemy was thinnest. Race for the rear areas. Scatter command structures. Paralyze logistics. Force the enemy to fight on ground he had not chosen. When Patton's Third Army was unleashed in August, it was the 4th Armored Division, leading the way, that turned doctrine into reality. In one stretch in late August, Wood's tankers covered more than 300 kilometers in 5 days. By the middle of September, they had outrun their own supply lines, and John S. Wood was not unhappy about it. On the 14th of September, the 4th Armored Division reached a small market town in the rolling farmland of Lorraine called Aracourt. It had a few hundred residents, a church, a square, stone barns. There was nothing strategically significant about Aracourt itself, but it sat on high ground, surrounded by gentle hills and small woods, and it formed a natural defense bowl looking east toward Germany. Wood ordered a halt. His tanks were nearly empty. His infantry support was lagging dozens of kilometers behind. His northern flank was wide open. His southern flank was wider. There were German forces gathering in the forests east of the Saale River. Aerial reconnaissance had begun to spot armored columns moving up from the south. Fresh formations. Vehicles that had not yet appeared on the battlefield. A textbook commander would have pulled back, would have consolidated, would have waited for the rest of the Third Army to catch up before risking such an exposed position. Wood did the opposite. He spread his combat commands across nearly 40 kilometers of frontage. Combat Command A, under Colonel Bruce C. Clark, a 43-year-old engineer turned tank commander with a reputation for cold tactical clarity, took the center, around the villages of Lezy and Besange-le-Petit. Combat Command B, under Brigadier General Holmes E. Dager, a quiet 51-year-old veteran, was positioned to protect the southern flank. The Reserve Command, the artillery battalions, the tank destroyer companies of the 704th Battalion, with their lightning-fast M18 Hellcats, were all woven into a web of mutually supporting positions. Hidden in tree lines, behind low ridges, in the dead ground that the rolling terrain provided, he did not dig trenches. He did not build static defensive lines. He kept everything mobile, everything ready to move at 5 minutes' notice in any direction. Every single American vehicle, from the heaviest Sherman to the lightest Jeep, carried a working radio. Every commander knew the call sign of every other commander in the division. Every artillery battery was tied into a fire direction center that could mass concentrated fire from multiple battalions onto a single coordinate within minutes of a radio call. On a German map, it looked like an army that had blundered. In reality, it was a trap with the lid open. Across the Saale, in the wooded country east of Lunéville and the gentle hills of the Saar, the German 5th Panzer Army was reforming. Its commander was General Hasso von Manteuffel. He was 47 years old. He came from a Prussian military family that stretched back generations. He stood barely 5 feet 2, the shortest senior commander in the Wehrmacht, and he made up for his size with a reputation for ferocious personal courage. He had commanded panzer formations in North Africa, in Tunisia, on the Eastern Front. He had broken Soviet armored attacks at Zhytomyr. He had been one of Hitler's personal favorites. In September 1944, he was handed 2 newly formed armored brigades, the 111th and the 113th, with orders to destroy the American spearhead at Aracourt. The 111th Panzer Brigade was commanded by Colonel Heinrich Bronsart von Schellendorf. Its target was Lunéville, on the southern shoulder of the American salient. The 113th Panzer Brigade was commanded by Colonel Erich von Seckendorf. Its target was Aracourt itself. Both brigades had been raised hastily that summer. equipped almost entirely with brand-new Panther tanks. Their crews were a mix. Some were Eastern Front veterans, pulled from recovery hospitals. Some were teenagers, 18 and 19 years old, with 2 or 3 weeks of training, sent into combat because Germany had no one else left. Panther itself was a masterpiece of engineering. 80 millimeters of frontal armor, sloped at 55 degrees, giving effective protection close to 140 millimeters. The 75 millimeter KWK-42 cannon, with a barrel 70 calibers long, could punch through the front armor of any American tank from more than a kilometer away. In a head-on duel in open country, an American Sherman against a Panther was not a fight, it was an execution. But the Panther had problems the Germans did not advertise. The turret traverse was hydraulic, but tied to engine RPM. Slow, painfully slow, when you needed to swing the gun onto a new target. The transmission was prone to catastrophic failure. The radios were not standard across the fleet. Many tanks could only receive orders from their platoon leader. They could not talk to each other. The crews of the new brigades had not trained together. They did not know each other's voices. They did not know each other's habits. And on the night of September 17th, in the woods east of Aracourt, the order came down from Berlin. Adolf Hitler had looked at the map in his bunker. He had seen the exposed American position. He had seen the open flanks, the overextended supply lines, the dangling vulnerability of the 4th Armored Division. He had concluded, and the entire German High Command had agreed, that the legendary George S. Patton had finally made a fatal mistake. The 5th Panzer Army was ordered to attack at dawn. In the farmhouse on the western side of the fog, John S. Wood was awake. The reports from his forward observers had been coming in all night. The sound of armored engines moving in the dark, the smell of diesel on the eastern wind. He had known they were coming. He had spent 2 days waiting for them. The Germans believed they had caught Patton at his most vulnerable moment. They did not understand that the man who had chosen this ground was not Patton. They did not understand that the position they were about to attack had been selected for one reason, and one reason only. It was the best place on the entire Western Front to kill a Panther tank. And the fog they believed was their greatest ally was about to become their grave. The American defensive posture around Aracourt in the second week of September 1944 was not a line on a map. It was a living thing. It breathed. It listened. It waited. John S. Wood spread his combat commands across the rolling farmland, like a man laying a fishing net across a river. Combat Command A under Colonel Bruce Clark held the center. Combat Command B under Brigadier General Holmes Dager anchored the south. Combat Command Reserve under Lieutenant Colonel Wendell Blanchard sat back as the closer. The villages along the eastern slope became forward positions. Lezay, Bezange-la-Petite, Rechicourt-la-Petite, Coincourt, names that French farmers had spoken for 1,000 years, names that within 48 hours would appear in after-action reports filed in Washington and Berlin. Wood did not order his men to dig trenches. He did not order them to build static defensive positions. He understood that against the Panther, a static defense was a coffin with a view. He ordered something different. Every Sherman tank was hull down behind a hedge, a ridge, a stone wall. Every M4 was paired with another M4, with overlapping fields of fire. Every M18 Hellcat tank destroyer was hidden in a tree line, ready to race out, fire, and disappear. Every artillery battery was tied into a fire direction center that could put a wall of high explosive shells onto a 6-digit grid coordinate within 3 minutes of a radio call. And every single American vehicle had a radio that worked. That last detail, more than the tanks, more than the artillery, more than the air support that was coming, was the secret weapon of the United States Army in the autumn of 1944. The M4 Sherman that the 4th Armored Division fielded at Aracourt was the most produced tank of the war. It weighed roughly 33 tons. It carried a 75mm cannon, modest by 1944 standards. Its frontal armor could be punched through by a Panther's gun from more than 1,000 meters. In a head-on fight on open ground, the Sherman had no chance. But the Sherman had a fast electro-hydraulic turret traverse that could swing a full circle in about 15 seconds. The Panther's turret was hydraulic too, but its motor was tied to engine speed, and at low throttle, the system crawled. In the time it took a Panther gunner to swing his cannon 90 degrees onto a new target, a Sherman gunner could swing his turret, acquire, and fire 3 rounds. 3. The Sherman engines, whether the Ford GAA V8 in the M43 or the Wright Radial in the older M4, were reliable. Boring. American. They started in the cold and ran for hundreds of hours without trouble. The Panther engine was temperamental and prone to catching fire. The Panther transmission failed at a rate that horrified the German officers, who had to recover the broken tanks under American artillery. And then there was the Hellcat. The M18 Hellcat tank destroyer was the fastest tracked vehicle of the entire war. It had been designed for one purpose. Speed American engineers had stripped away nearly all the armor, less than an inch on the front. The crew rode in an open-topped turret, exposed to the weather and the shrapnel and the fear. They were not supposed to absorb hits. They were supposed to never be hit. The Hellcat could reach 55 miles per hour on a paved road. On the muddy farm tracks of Lorraine, it managed 40. That was twice the cross-country speed of a Panther. It mounted a 76mm cannon that could, with the right ammunition and the right angle, punch through the side or rear armor of a Panther at 600 meters. The men who crewed the M18 had a single doctrine, written nowhere in any official manual: find the side, fire 1 round, disappear. Around the village of Bézange-le-Petit, hidden in a stand of trees behind a low ridge, on the morning of September 19, 1944, a platoon of M18 Hellcats from C Company, 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, sat with their engines cold and their crews wide awake. Their commander was a first lieutenant named Edwin H. Laper. He was in his early 20s. He had never fought a major armored battle in his life. He would, before the sun rose 3 hours higher, fire 4 cannon rounds and destroy 4 Panther tanks. But before Laper, there was Lunéville. Lunéville is a town on the Meurthe River, 25 kilometers south of Aracourt. On the night of September 17, 1944, Colonel Heinrich Bronsart von Schellendorf received his orders from General Hasso von Manteuffel. The 111th Panzer Brigade would cross the Meurthe before dawn. It would strike the southern shoulder of the American salient. It would draw American attention south, while the 113th Panzer Brigade prepared the main blow against Aracourt itself the following morning. It was a sound plan. On paper, the 111th Panzer Brigade was a brand new formation. Schellendorf himself had been given command only weeks before. His men, his Panthers, his Mark IV tanks, his half-tracks, his infantry, had never trained together as a unit. Some of his crews had 3 weeks of experience. Some had 10 years. None of them knew the men in the tank to the left or the right. At dawn on September 18, the 111th moved into Lunéville. They expected to find scattered American cavalry units, light reconnaissance forces, easy targets. They found instead elements of Combat Command Reserve. They found self-propelled tank destroyers. They found Sherman tanks dug in at every intersection. They found that the Americans had been waiting for them. The street fighting in Lunéville lasted all day. The German Panthers, designed for open country, were terrible in a town. Their long barrels caught on doorways. Their slow turrets could not respond to American tanks darting from alley to alley. By evening, The 111th Panzer Brigade had lost more vehicles than it had any business losing on the first morning of a counteroffensive. Schellendorf pulled back. He reorganized. He waited for the main attack. Across the night fields, 25 kilometers to the north, Colonel Erich von Seckendorf was bringing the 113th Panzer Brigade up to the line of departure. Seckendorf was a professional soldier. He had served in the Wehrmacht through the long years of the war. He had been wounded twice. His men described him in their letters home as quiet, careful, and old before his time. He did not want this attack. He had told his staff so. The terrain was wrong. The intelligence was thin. The supporting infantry had not arrived. But the order had come from Berlin. At 4 in the morning on September 19, 1944, the engines of the 113th Panzer Brigade rumbled to life in the woods east of the Saale River. The fog was already thick. Visibility was less than 100 meters. The crews could not see their own platoon leaders. They moved out anyway. The lead element approached the village of Rechicourt-le-Petit at 7:30 in the morning. The fog had thickened. The Panthers had to roll forward with their commanders standing in the open cupolas, calling directions down to the drivers, because no other system worked. They had no idea where the American positions were. They had no real radio contact with each other. They were, in the most literal sense, blind. And what they did not know was that the Americans had a radio in every tank. Lieutenant Edwin Leper was sitting in the turret of his lead M18 Hellcat when his platoon sergeant called him on the radio and said the words that thousands of American tankers would remember for the rest of their lives. Tanks. Front. Multiple. Leper looked through the fog. He saw movement, a shape darker than the mist, the unmistakable silhouette of a Panther turret 50 meters away. He fired. The 76mm armor piercing round struck the Panther in the left side, just behind the driver. The tank exploded. Then a second Panther rolled forward into the gap. Leper fired again. The second tank burned. Then a third. Then a fourth. 4 Panthers, 4 shots, 4 kills in less than 2 minutes. The German crews in the column behind could not understand what was happening. They could not see Leper's position. They could not see the fire that was killing them. They could not call for help because their radios were not networked together. They could only hear the explosions ahead of them and feel the wave of heat as the Panthers in front of them died one after another in the fog. In a separate engagement 2 kilometers north, Captain William A. Dwight, commanding B Company of the 37th Tank Battalion, swung his platoon of Shermans against the right flank of the German advance. Dwight was a young man. He had been a civilian in 1941. He had been a tank commander for less than 2 years. He fought that morning with the cold efficiency of a man who knew that hesitation would kill his crew. By mid-morning, Dwight's Shermans had destroyed more Panthers and chased the survivors back into the fog. The 113th Panzer Brigade had been gutted before it ever reached its objective, and this was the first twist of the battle. The fog that the German planners had counted on as their greatest advantage was not their advantage at all. The Germans had assumed the fog would hide their advance. It did, but it also blinded their tanks, separated their crews, and silenced their already weak radio network. A German Panther in the fog could not see 50 meters in front of it. It could not coordinate with the tank beside it. It could not call its commander. The Americans were blind, too. But the Americans could talk. Every Sherman commander could hear every other Sherman commander on the divisional net. Every Hellcat platoon could be guided by spotters on high ground who saw flashes through the mist. Every artillery battery could be redirected within minutes by a radio call from a tank turret. Blind eyes and open ears beat blind eyes and a closed mouth. Every time. And on the morning of September 19, 1944, In the fog of Lorraine, that ancient truth of warfare killed a brigade, and Colonel Heinrich Bronsart von Schellendorf did not survive the first week of the battle. The exact circumstances of his death have never been fully documented. The German records of the period are fragmentary. Some accounts place him in a tank that was destroyed by American fire near Luneville. Others place him on foot, trying to rally a broken company of Panzer Grenadiers under American artillery. What the records agree on is that he died trying to do what his orders demanded, with a brigade that had been thrown into combat before it was ready, against an enemy his superiors had told him was beaten. He was a professional. He died as professionals do, doing his duty in a war that had already been lost, and his death exposed the second great failure of the German plan. When Schellendorf was killed, the 111th Panzer Brigade did not simply lose a commander. It lost the only man who could coordinate it, because the Panthers themselves could not coordinate. Their radios were too primitive. Their crews had never trained together. Their platoon leaders, the men who would have stepped up to fill the gap, did not know each other's faces, let alone their tactical preferences. The 111th did not collapse in a single moment. It dissolved over 48 hours, the way a sandcastle dissolves in a rising tide. Each Panther fought its own war. Each crew made its own decisions. Each tank rolled forward into the fog, believing the other Panthers in its company were nearby, and turned back at the moment of greatest danger to find that it was alone. This was the deeper lesson of Aracourt, and the Germans would not understand it for years. The Panther was a magnificent tank on paper, but a magnificent tank without a command system is not a weapon. It is a target with an aim. By the evening of September 19, Manteuffel knew. He sat in his command post in a farmhouse east of Chateau Salins and read the reports coming in from both brigades. The 111th was bleeding. The 113th was bleeding worse. The dawn attack had not produced surprise. The American defense had not collapsed. The Panthers were not chewing through the Sherman lines. They were dying in 2s and 3s in fog, so thick the survivors could not even identify the tanks that had killed them. Manteuffel called Army Group G. He asked permission to withdraw, to regroup, to preserve what was left of his brigades for a more carefully planned operation. The answer came back from Berlin within hours. No. Hitler had been told the Americans were on the verge of breaking. Hitler had been told that Patton's overextension was about to become Patton's grave. Hitler had committed his last great armored reserves in the West to this operation. Hitler would not accept that the operation was failing. The 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades and any other formations Manteuffel could scrape together would attack again at dawn on September 20. And here was the third hard truth of Aracourt, and perhaps the cruelest one. The man who killed the Panthers at Aracourt was not John Wood. It was not Bruce Clark. It was not Edwin Laper or William Dwight or Creighton Abrams. The man who killed the Panthers at Aracourt was Adolf Hitler. If Hitler had allowed Manteuffel to withdraw, on the night of September 19, the 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades could have been pulled back, rebuilt, refitted. Their surviving crews could have been used to train new units. Their Panthers could have been deployed in a defensive role where the heavy armor and powerful guns would have mattered most. Instead, Hitler ordered them to keep attacking. Into ground they had already failed to take. Into fog they could not see through. Into a defensive system that had been designed specifically to destroy them. The next morning, the fog began to thin. By mid-morning on September 20, the cloud cover was breaking. Patches of blue sky were appearing. The temperature was rising. And the worst possible thing that could happen to a German armored brigade on the Western Front in 1944 was happening above their heads. The Americans were getting their Air Force back. Brigadier General Otto Paul Wayland was 41 years old. He commanded the 19th Tactical Air Command. He worked closely with Patton, and the two men had built something that the German Luftwaffe, even at the height of its power, had never quite managed. A perfect instantaneous fusion of ground forces and air forces. Wayland's pilots flew the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. The Thunderbolt was an enormous aircraft. It weighed nearly 5 tons empty, and well over 7 tons when fully loaded for combat. Its radial engine produced over 2,000 horsepower. The pilots called it the Jug because the fuselage was shaped like an old milk bottle. It was the most heavily armored fighter aircraft of the war. It could absorb damage that would have shattered a Spitfire or a Mustang. It carried 850 caliber machine guns, 10 high-velocity aerial rockets, and up to 1,000 pounds of bombs. P-47 was, in every meaningful sense, a flying tank with a 400-mile-per-hour top speed. And when the fog lifted on September 20, 1944, hundreds of them came hunting. The system Patton and Wayland had built was the first true armored column cover in military history. American tank companies on the ground carried VHF radios that could speak directly to the Thunderbolts circling overhead. A forward air controller, sometimes a young Air Corps pilot riding in a Sherman, could mark a target with a colored smoke shell, get on the radio, and have a flight of 47s diving onto German tanks within minutes. The Panthers had no answer for this. Panther armor was thickest in front, 80 millimeters at 55 degrees, devastating in a head-on fight. But the armor on top of the engine deck was less than 20 millimeters, flat, horizontal, designed against artillery fragments, not against a 5-inch rocket diving in at 400 miles per hour. The Thunderbolts came down through the gaps in the clouds and fired their rockets straight into the tops of the Panthers. The HVR rocket carried a substantial warhead. It did not need to penetrate the engine deck cleanly. It only needed to ignite the fuel tanks or the ammunition stowage. And when it did, the Panther died in a fireball that could be seen 10 kilometers away. By the evening of September 20, the 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades had effectively ceased to exist as offensive formations. Their surviving Panthers were scattered across 20 kilometers of Lorraine countryside. Their crews were sleeping in ditches. Their supply trucks had been hunted down on the roads. But Hitler had ordered the attack to continue, so Manteuffel scraped together more units. He stripped the 11th Panzer Division, a battle-hardened formation that had fought from Russia to France, and committed it to the Arracourt sector. He pulled in elements of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division. He patched together combat groups from training cadres and depot units. In the days that followed, around the 24th and 25th of September, the second wave attacked. It met the same fate as the first. By now, the Americans had been on the ground for a week. They knew every ridge, every tree line, every dead patch of ground where a Panther might try to creep up unobserved. The artillery was zeroed in on every approach. The forward air controllers had memorized every landmark, and waiting in his command post at the head of the 37th Tank Battalion was a lieutenant colonel named Creighton W. Abrams. Abrams was 30 years old. He was the son of a railroad mechanic from Massachusetts. He was solid and compact and physically unimpressive, with a cigar usually clenched in the corner of his mouth and a vocabulary that made his radio operator wince. He was, by the unanimous and reverent assessment of every officer who served with him in the 4th Armored Division, the single best tank battalion commander in the United States Army. He would, 24 years later, command all American forces in the Vietnam War. But on September 22, 1944, Abrams was leading a counterattack against the second German wave. His Shermans rolled out of their concealed positions. and into the open. They engaged the lead elements of the 11th Panzer Division at ranges between 400 and 1,000 meters. The German tanks were better, gun for gun, but Abrams' men were faster, better coordinated, and supported by every weapon system the Americans had built. The fight lasted 3 days. By September 25, the German offensive had been broken a second time. Colonel Erich von Seckendorf, the commander of the 113th Panzer Brigade, died in the closing days of the battle. The exact date is uncertain in the surviving records. What is known is that he, like Schellendorf before him, died in command of a unit that had been committed to a battle his commanders should never have ordered. Both brigade commanders, dead, both brigades destroyed, and the German High Command was still not done. On September 29, 1944, the final assault came. One last attempt by Manteuffel to salvage something, anything, from the wreckage. The Germans assembled what was left of their armor for a coordinated push against multiple American positions at once. They drove into the same ambushes that had killed the previous waves. They were destroyed within hours. When the smoke cleared, the fields of Aracourt were littered with the burning hulks of Panthers and Mark IV tanks and self-propelled assault guns. The fields, the country lanes, the wheat stubble of late September Lorraine were covered in twisted steel, and here, in the records that would not be opened until decades later, lies the deepest twist of the story. When the German archives were finally examined by historians in the years after the war, when the surviving officers were interviewed, when Manteuffel himself sat down with the British military historian Basil Liddell Hart for a series of post-war conversations, a quiet and uncomfortable truth came out. Manteuffel had known. By the evening of September 19, less than 24 hours into the offensive, Manteuffel had understood that the attack could not succeed. The intelligence assessments from Berlin had been wrong. The American defense was not collapsing. The Panther brigades were not breaking through. The whole operational concept had been built on a false reading of the battlefield. But Manteuffel had kept ordering his men forward, day after day, wave after wave, brigade after brigade, not because he believed in victory, not because he saw an opportunity, but because the order came from Hitler, and no senior German commander in the autumn of 1944 was willing to be the man who told the Führer that one of his decisions was wrong. The men in the Panthers, the 18-year-old gunners, the 30-year-old veterans of Russia, the colonels and the captains and the privates who burned in their fighting compartments at Aracourt were not just killed by American fire. They were killed by the silence of their own commanders, by a chain of command so afraid of its own leader that it kept feeding men into a meat grinder long after every professional officer knew the battle was already lost. The Germans believed Patton had made a fatal mistake. The fatal mistake was their own, and in a farmhouse east of Aracourt on the evening of September 29, 1944, John S. Wood stood looking at a map of the battlefield where his division had just destroyed Hitler's last major armored counteroffensive in the west before the Ardennes. He did not yet know what was coming. He did not yet know that the same war machine he had just rescued was going to come for him next. When the last German tank stopped burning in the fields east of Aracourt, December 29, 1944, the men of the 4th Armored Division climbed out of their Shermans and their Hellcats and their command jeeps and walked through one of the most one-sided armored victories of the Second World War. The numbers, when they were finally compiled by army historians in the years after the war, were almost difficult to believe. The German 5th Panzer Army had lost approximately 86 tanks and assault guns destroyed at Aracourt. The figure is conservative. The official United States Army history, written by Hugh M. Cole and published in 1950, settled on that count after careful examination of the wreckage. Modern historians, including Stephen Zaloga and Christopher Gable, place the total slightly higher when damaged vehicles abandoned on the field are included. But on either accounting, the Germans had lost the equivalent of an entire armored brigade, sometimes two. The Americans had lost approximately 25 tanks of their own, and the 4th Armored Division had suffered fewer than 300 men, killed and wounded in 11 days of fighting against the heaviest concentration of German armor seen on the Western Front since D-Day. By any measure that armies used to grade themselves, this was a triumph. And it was here, in the quiet weeks after Aracourt, that the second great truth of this story began to reveal itself. A truth that the post-war histories would soften. A truth that the war movies would never quite show. The truth was this: Aracourt did not win the Lorraine campaign. It only proved that the campaign could not be won the way Patton wanted to win it. In the second week of October, while John S. Wood was still trying to absorb the scale of what his men had accomplished, the Third Army was ordered east. Patton's tanks turned toward the city of Metz, an ancient fortress town on the Moselle River, surrounded by a ring of concrete forts that the French had built in the 19th century and the Germans had improved. What followed was not a campaign of maneuver, it was a siege. The mud of October became the snow of November, became the freezing rain of early December. Patton's columns, which had moved hundreds of kilometers across France in August, now measured their progress in meters. The Germans held every fort. The Americans bled for every yard. By the time the last German position at Metz fell in mid-December, the Third Army had taken nearly 50,000 casualties in the broader Lorraine campaign. The numbers were not advertised in the American press. The mythology that had built up around Patton, around the dashing cavalryman who could not be stopped, did not survive close examination of those casualty lists. But the mythology was useful to the war effort, and the casualty lists were filed in places where ordinary citizens did not look. And here is where the seventh hard truth of this story lands. Aracourt was a tactical masterpiece. The Lorraine campaign that contained it was a strategic disappointment. The general the Germans believed had made a fatal mistake at Aracourt, had in fact presided over months of expensive failure in the same campaign, the same speed and aggression that had carried the Third Army across France in August could not break a properly prepared defensive line in October. When the conditions changed, Patton's signature style stopped working. The man who had actually built the victory at Aracourt watched all of this from a position of declining usefulness. By late November, the 4th Armored Division was being used as a battering ram against German defensive lines that called for infantry, not maneuver. Wood objected, Wood argued. Wood wrote sharp memorandums to his corps commander. His corps commander was Major General Manton S. Eddy. Eddy was a 52-year-old infantry officer. He commanded the 12th Corps, which included the 4th Armored. He was a competent administrator and a careful planner. He did not share Wood's belief in mobile warfare as the answer to every problem. He did not appreciate being lectured by a subordinate, and by the end of November, he had begun a quiet correspondence with Patton about the question of Wood's continued fitness for command. The official reason was exhaustion. Wood had been driving himself for months. He commanded from the front. He slept in jeeps. He ate cold rations. He had lost weight. His staff officers noticed his temper getting shorter. Eddy noticed too and put it in writing. On December 3, 1944, George S. Patton signed the order that sent John Shirley Wood back to the United States. Officially, it was a rest leave. Officially, he was being given time to recover from combat fatigue. Officially, his command of the 4th Armored Division was a temporary interruption. Wood himself knew better. He never commanded troops in combat again. And this was the eighth and quietest twist of the entire story. The man who had designed the destruction of 2 German panzer brigades, the man whose tactical innovations would shape American armored doctrine for the next half-century, was not removed by court-martial. He was not relieved for cause. He was not disgraced. He was diagnosed. His own army sent him home with a medical note. After the war ended, Hasso von Manteuffel sat in an American prisoner of war camp. He had surrendered to United States forces in Austria in May of 1945. He would be released in 1947. He would not be charged with war crimes. He would, in the years that followed, become a member of the West German Parliament and a respected voice on questions of armored warfare. Sometime in the late 1940s, the British military historian Basil Henry Liddell Hart began interviewing the surviving German commanders for a book that would be published in 1948 as The Other Side of the Hill. Manteuffel was one of his most thoughtful subjects. When Liddell Hart asked him about Aracourt, Manteuffel did not blame the weather. He did not blame the terrain. He did not blame the Panthers or the radios or the inexperienced crews. He blamed his own intelligence. He blamed his own assumptions. And he described the American defense in the kind of careful professional language that surviving German commanders rarely used about their enemies. As a tactical concept, his army had failed to understand in time. The German who had ordered the attack at Aracourt was the man who, in the end, recognized most clearly what had happened to him. The lessons of Aracourt did not stay in the archives. In the years after the war, the United States Army built its post-war armored doctrine around the principles Wood had demonstrated. Combined arms, tight integration of armor, infantry, artillery, and air support, aggressive use of communications, flexible, fast-moving formations that could absorb enemy thrusts and counterattack on their own initiative. The official manuals did not always credit Wood by name. The lessons did not have to. In June of 1967, on a different continent, in a different war, an Israeli general named Israel Tal led an armored division across the Sinai Peninsula against a numerically superior Egyptian armored force. Tal had read the American studies. He knew the Aracourt playbook. He used speed, coordination, and combined arms to destroy enemy formations equipped with Soviet tanks at a kill ratio that would have looked familiar to any veteran of the 4th Armored Division. The Six-Day War was, in significant part, a continuation of the doctrine that had been proven in the Fog of Lorraine 23 years earlier. John S. Wood retired from the United States Army in 1946. He was a major general. He had never been given another combat command after Aracourt. He had never been promoted again. He went home eventually to Reno, Nevada, and lived quietly for 20 more years. He gave occasional interviews. He wrote a few articles. He watched the army he loved adopt many of the ideas he had championed without ever quite acknowledging where those ideas had come from. He attended reunions of the 4th Armored Division. The men who had served under him stood when he entered the room. He died on the 2nd of July, 1966. He was 78 years old. The obituaries in the major American newspapers were brief and respectful and did not say very much. Most readers would not have recognized his name. It was not until the 1990s, when military historians like Christopher Gable and Stephen Zaloga began publishing detailed studies of the Lorraine campaign drawing on newly accessible German archives, that the full picture of what Wood had accomplished at Aracourt finally began to come into focus. The German records told a story the American records had been too modest to tell. The German records named Wood. They named his tactics. They named the moment at which Manteuffel had understood the battle was lost. By the time the historians caught up, John S. Wood had been in his grave for nearly 30 years, and so we come to the end of this story. Two armies met in the fog of Lorraine in September 1944. One army believed its enemy had made a fatal mistake. The other army had set the trap. The trap closed. The first army died. The lesson of Aracourt is not that American equipment was superior. It was not. The Panther was a better tank than the Sherman. The Hellcat was a more fragile vehicle than the Panther. The German crews, man for man, were as brave as any soldiers in the war. The lesson of Aracourt is that the side that builds a better system beats the side that builds better weapons. The Americans had radios that worked in every vehicle. The Americans had air support that could be called by a tank commander on the ground. The Americans had artillery that could mass on a coordinate within minutes. The Americans had a commander who trusted his subordinates and a doctrine that rewarded initiative. The Germans had magnificent tanks and a chain of command that was afraid of its own dictator. In modern war, the second loses to the first every time. And there is one final lesson here, a harder one, a more uncomfortable one. The men who design the victories are not always the men who are remembered for them. George S. Patton became a legend. John S. Wood became a footnote. The Germans, in the end, gave Wood the recognition his own army denied him. The supposed fatal mistake of George S. Patton was not Patton's mistake at all. And the man most responsible for the most lopsided armored victory of the Western Front was, 3 months after his greatest triumph, sitting on a train going home to a quiet retirement that would last 20 years and end with an obituary. Nobody noticed. The institutions that win the wars are often unkind to the people who teach them how. That is the story of those 11 days in September 1944, in the fog of Lorraine, when the Germans believed Patton had made a fatal mistake. They were right about the mistake. They were wrong about whose mistake it was.